think Chris you met earlier, and I'm joined by Flora from Scottish Government. Thank you, Flora, for joining us. Great. So our last session of the day before lunch, and we've got a reasonable amount of time for this, because I don't think I'm going to take half an hour to close the conference. So we can run over a bit at the end in questions here if anyone has any. So have we got any questions from the floor? Yes, at the back there. David. I think that is David. I can see in the gloom up there. Yeah.
It's David Patterson, St Andrews. So marine net gain and how we're going to cope with that cross-border as well. So how much discussion is there with Scottish Government and their plans for doing, I guess, similar types of activity? How joined up is the thinking? That's question one. And the second question is, will there be any kind of strong legislative control to promote the marine net gain among the different operations that are working offshore? Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think what I'm going to ask is both Eddie and Flora, if they can take that question. I might ask Eddie first, just to give Flora a bit of time to sort of think. Eddie, there's a question about how joined up is thinking across the devolves, and also I know England is different from Scotland. What is the legislative control going to be around it?
Okay, I'm wishing I had colleagues here now for this. You can probably answer both those questions much better than I can, but I'll have a stab. So, number one, we work to DEFRA. I think it's fair to say we're trying to keep up. We don't do policy, we do evidence, essentially, in this space. So we're trying to answer questions that are coming up in our very regular discussions with DEFRA. I do believe DEFRA talk to Scotland, but I will pass that one over in a second. The other thing to say, net gain generally, we've had interest from all over the world on everything from the policy to the metrics. We keep hearing now, I think it's on 5 continents now, a version of the BNG metric, I'm told. Now that we're looking at marine metrics, essentially, assessment frameworks, I gather we're having lots of interest from over the water on both sides, I think. So that's probably all I can say on that, but you may have more.
Yeah, I suppose a similar answer in that I don't work in the policy area of the Marine Directorate, more in the science and evidence. I know that the policy is all under development, and it's, I think, more described as nature positive rather than marine net gain in the Scottish context, but similar, means the same thing, I guess. We are working on a kind of review of the evidence and looking at these evidence gaps to try and help understand where to best focus the efforts. But I think the evidence gaps are similar across. There are some features that occur in Scotland that don't occur in England, but other than that, they grow the same way. So that's probably all I can say on that.
Thank you both.
Just on the legislative process, so that slide I put up at the start, the DEFRA kind of priorities that they're working on, that is part of the plan. I think the thing, and it was consulted on as well, that there would need to be some kind of legislative underpinning for net gain. I mean, certainly for biodiversity net gain there is. That came in, but it came in at the end. So people were doing BNG for years before that, using various iterations of the metric, because as a house builder, you want to show that you're doing something that is provable, with that sort of etch-a-sketch, if you like, that you've had a positive impact overall of your development, because it's very, very handy for PR, amongst other things. But at the end of the day, if you want to create that level playing field, and BNG is probably important to say is essentially a market sort of model. It's a market-driven approach to nature recovery. You need the legislation to make it fair across the piece. We're not entirely sure how that's going to work for marine, because it's the Crown Estate own the land, essentially, own the seabed. So it'll be an interesting journey, I think, towards that legislation, but it will be needed, I think.
And if I can add to that, it's worth noting that the legislative framework in England is quite different to what it will be in Scotland. So there is an aspiration that it will be part of a development consent. Once you make it part of a development consent, you need compliance, you need monitoring, you need success criteria. It becomes a legal responsibility. And I believe, I think that in Scotland it's being approached slightly differently. The other thing that's worth noting is that what created the market for BNG and allowed private sector investors to come in and to front load the habitat that was needed terrestrially was the legal regime. So without that legal regime, the investment is too risky, effectively. But if you have that legal regime, it's tied into planning and there's a solid basis for people to invest in, and that's what creates that market. And it's that level of risk and assurance which is one of the main challenges with things like carbon markets, because you don't have that level of assurance around it, and that's why they're much riskier now. Sorry. Any more questions from the floor? Yes.
Hello, it's Alethea Madgett at the National Decommissioning Centre. I'm sorry, I have questions for the same people. Sorry. You said about the policy still being in development at the moment. How much is the evidence and sort of the data that's going to be incorporated into the evidence gaps that you've identified? How much is that feeding into the policy development?
I'd like to say very heavily. And it's not just us working on these projects. I mean, we have our sort of area of expertise that we try and apply and run those projects, but there are lots of others, working on all those green boxes that are put up on the screen. But there are sort of elements of the policy, and I come from a BNG, you can probably tell, sort of background, and there are so many rules in place to ensure that market that Dickon mentions runs well and gets the policy outcomes that were stated at the start. And almost it's the same thing, I think, because a lot of those policy decisions rely on the evidence base to work out what might happen. So things like the pilots that I mentioned very briefly, they're going to be absolutely fundamental, because otherwise you just assume that you can deliver marine net gain until you hit a big problem. So having those pilots in place and working through the problems well ahead of the policy and definitely the legislation is going to be really important to feed that in, because then we know what policy problems we need to jointly solve. But we work very closely with the DEFRA team on all of that.
I don't know whether, Martin, if you've got anything you want to add to that or not, from a DEFRA perspective. If not, that's fine. So the thing I would add to what Eddie said, and this is from our experience of working on that assessment framework project, is that there's a real need to understand how do you measure ecological loss and ecological gain in a way that is robust enough to be put into a regulatory process. And we know how to do that on a feature-based level, so I know how to measure species X or species Y, and I know what the effect's going to be. But that produces quite a rigid framework. And if you were going to step up a level to say, I want to understand the function of species X or species Y in the ecosystem, and then maybe provide net gain with something that provides an equivalent function, how easy is it to do that? And we might be able to do that across some trophic levels and not others. And a lot of the work coming out of Insight and EcoWind is really feeding into that. And the next level of complexity of saying, can we use ecosystem services or a natural capital approach? And is that ecologically meaningful or not? And it's those types of questions that we need to answer so that the policy itself can be meaningful and robust. And particularly when you're talking about policy that needs to fit into a regulatory process, that robustness question is really important.
I just have one more thing to say, if that's okay. So a really good example is within BNG, you have trading rules. That's all part of that playing field and creating the market. And it comes down, so certain habitats have a high distinctiveness, and if you lose them or you lose condition of them, you have to deliver condition for that or even new habitat for that exact same habitat. So if you lose salt marsh, you have to create salt marsh to a certain level, a certain amount. That's not being decided for marine, as Dickon says, that might not even be the best fit to get some ocean recovery underway. So we may need more flexibility or to be a bit more nuanced about the way we approach it. It may not even be possible to replace on a like-for-like basis. Yeah.
Thanks, Eddie.
It's part of the evidence for the policy, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. We've got a couple of questions online, so I think if we could go to Georgina. Thanks, Freya.
Thanks, Dickon. Yeah, the first one is from Anmet, and I think it's a really interesting question for the Insight programme and the rest of the panel. Anmet asked, kind of following up on the previous kind of devolved communications and saying, could the net gain approach maybe come to form part of a greater North Sea Basin initiative? And if you were to use the net gain approach for decommissioning, what would you see as the baseline towards which you would assess the gains and the losses?
That's a very interesting question. If I look at the first part, when you're setting up a new research program, you try to outline what your key targets and your ambitions are for that program. And the way, if we take the values of marine artificial structures program, for example, within there, which you'll all see in the pre-announcement, but a lot more information when the full announcement is out. There are high-level requirements that will be necessary for successful projects that will be able to, that will go into that space. Now it's not, another thing with setting up research programs is you don't want to be too prescriptive, and then that really limits and narrows the scope of what's out there, because there could be some fantastic research ideas that haven't yet come to play in all this. And so you sort of scope it in such a way that it's detailed but not too detailed, that it allows that, that scope to be fleshed out by the research team. And for the second part of the question, with regards to how that would work, or how that could work, I think it was how that could work with sort of current net gain thinking and ideas, and across the North Sea basin. Well, there's a political element to that, and we've touched on that today. There's another element of that, which is a collaborative element that has been raised by the DEFRA team here, and it would work well working with people already working in that space, and seeing can the research teams collaborate with those people and collectively deliver something of value across the North Sea.
Just thanks, Hank. I was wondering whether any of the others had a view on how you consider connectivity in the North Sea in terms of biodiversity.
I think just to make a general statement, as Henk had said, about the importance of collaboration, I think when we look at things like net gain, very much like the first question I think we had today as well, on this panel anyway, and that devolved and UK government and Scottish government, for example, interplay, I think it's important when it's the same processes or similar processes which are measuring the same things, that we do have that connection, and we look at a holistic view and perhaps a whole UK view, and then that could be expanded out further and further and further, as much as you like to go to a global ocean type view. And of course that might be blue sky thinking and very, very difficult as well, but I think it has its value. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say to that, actually.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I guess it depends what the question is that's being asked, and one of these things we think about with environmental impact assessments is these cumulative effects, and when you have a footprint of an impact, it often gets compared to the UK seabed as a whole. But if you go to Orkney, for example, and ask people there, their sandy habitats are not comparable to some of the other ones. So yeah, I think ideally you could do experiments that were nationally representative. And some of these ecosystem models help with that, because you can look at that on a geographic scale. But yes, it depends what question you're asking, really. And I think it is important to recognise these local effects in some circumstances.
Thanks, Flora. Georgina, we've got another question online.
So there's one from David Santillo from Greenpeace. It's an open question for all the panel. He said, for marine artificial structures to contribute to marine net gain, would it be necessary to demonstrate conclusively that an increase in biomass was new production and not aggregation around the structure, and that there were demonstrable benefits for biodiversity at a regional level rather than just higher biodiversity around the structure?
And he's also just added, and by extension, would you need to be able to also demonstrate there not being the loss of net gain elsewhere? So it's the aggregation versus production question, and there's a question about spatial scale as well, and about whether you're looking at net gain on a local scale or a broader scale. And obviously it gets more difficult to measure the bigger that scale gets. So over to you, Eddie.
I can start and then throw it open to think. So I think anything's possible at this stage. I think we're at that part of the project, certainly for the MNJAF, the Marine Net Gain Assessment Frameworks project, that we need to have those discussions. I didn't really get time to sort of go into too much detail on that, but hopefully you got the impression there's an ecological aspect to the project, but I think even more importantly, there's a consensus building part of the project, sort of working across all of those various subsections of the marine sector to try and get that understanding. So do you need to replace like for like? Can you be more flexible? Can you be more holistic? Can you be more natural capital based? But also, could you be more flexible in your scale? Going back to the question, so could you have 9 developments all contributing to a project that's a huge scale, but somewhere else to deliver gains? So I think all those questions are kind of on the table, but I think it's those kind of questions we need to be answering. I think.
Thank you, Eddie. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to add to that? Hank?
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on the aggregation versus production angle of that. And I think this touches on what Richard mentioned earlier. There's a philosophical element as to what we call aggregation and what we call production. And as we saw with some of the projects yesterday, that where previously you had a sedimentary plain with sedimentary species that live in the sediments, so predominantly in fauna, and now you've got a hard structure on top of that. Originally, the hard structure would have been completely bare, but we saw that larvae are constantly moving around in that soup of the North Sea, which is often the color of soup at times. But the moment they colonize on that structure, that is an aggregation, but they're growing, and then that becomes production. But do we call that aggregation? Do we call that production? So I'd argue for a need to better define these things. In terms of how the biodiversity view that, I don't think they care about a definition. They are growing and reproducing on those structures. The interesting questions that we're hoping to get into will be about fish and about larger animals, the marine mammals. What are they doing around these structures? And we do know, yes, they do aggregate. And we've got some idea as to production. But going further into that will be necessary to answer David's question, I think.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that Paul Fernandez's project on fish spams is looking at exactly that, and Paul is on our technical advisory group, so it will be the types of questions that we'll be putting to him in that process. We've got any more questions from the floor? Yes.
Just a little bit to add to that, Dickon.
Yes,
we also need to consider both what's below the water, but also what's colonised on the top sides potentially. Are we doing harm to populations of seabirds, for instance, by removing some of these structures? If you've got a protected species that's colonised, are we justified in scaring it away and sending it off to find a new home or not? And these are open questions at the moment, and I think you'd get different answers from different groups depending who you speak to as well. And so it's, again, weighing all these things up.
Thank you, Martin. Richard, and then I'll come to that one now.
So really just a query on scope. A lot of you have mentioned this imminent call on value of structures in the marine environment. Hank, you delineated it as North Sea Basin, and I'm just wanting clarity on, is it geographically limited to that? It seems odd to restrict UK research spending, because we've got offshore wind going into the Celtic Sea, and there's other parts of the UK that also matter. So that's one question: is it geographically constrained in that way? And then the second part is also scope. What are we calling a structure? We heard right at the start of the day there were different legal definitions, and are we including it in this sea walls, flood defences, or all kinds of structures? Because there could be, to me, they would be part of the broader ecological consideration. And while you're doing it, you should look at more than just an old oil and gas structure. But I'm just curious to know what your view, especially given that there might be more time to frame it, what your consideration of the panel's consideration of the scope is. Yeah.
Good. Two quick answers there. We're focusing where the action is, Richard. So the North Sea Basin is where we think is going to be a hotbed for all of this activity. There will be opportunity for proposals to submit similar studies that are relevant to the North Sea Basin, but I think the North Sea Basin, any proposal for that would be more highly regarded. As for definition of structures, again, it's focusing on the hot topics, and it's that's oil and gas infrastructure and what we do with that, and also offshore wind infrastructure. So the project will have to look at both of those industries. So.
Thanks, Henk. I'll go for the question here.
Hi, my name's Richard Stark. I'm a PhD researcher, just about finished, at Dundee University. So I kind of just wanted to highlight, I suppose, that the disjointed approach between the policy intent that was highlighted by the chap from Shell earlier on, and the application in the comparative assessment process that the decommissioning of North Sea infrastructure goes through. And effectively, the clear seabed that is an interpretation of the precautionary principle by the Secretary of State within the guidance notes. It's not anywhere else in any of the policy or legislation or any of that stuff. He just decided this is what it was, pretty much in the aftermath of Brent Spar. What it does is it discounts the value of all of this science that we're doing today. Yeah, because what happens in the comparative assessment process is that you score environmental value and that kind of stuff, yeah? And it's either more preferred or less preferred, or 1 to 5 or whatever. So a clear seabed gets scored a 5, because that's the best, because that's the policy intent. So anything that doesn't leave a clear seabed scores less. Yeah? So it doesn't really matter, well, it does matter, but that's not the right word, but whatever you have decided in all of this stuff, and all the money that's been spent, it's never as good as a clear seabed. Yeah? So all the environmental discussions don't really work. Moving on from that, the case-by-case approach, which again is very similar, it's based on the same idea in terms of technical capability. So the reason there's a case-by-case approach is because the structures are all different, and it's all about their technical removal, because when they put the infrastructure in place in the 1990s, that was what people were thinking, not the infrastructure, the regulation. In the 1990s, that's what they were interested in. They weren't interested in environmental stuff so much then. So what happens is that we apply a case-by-case approach, which in the comparative assessment process is a field-by-field approach. Yeah, so we do it as the structure comes to be decommissioned. We start thinking about it. When you so therefore your ecosystem-based approach that everything's meant to be based on, that's not what it's based on. It's based on a structure and what's its effect locally. So both of those are misinterpretations within how the engineers who run the comparative assessment approach, how they interpret the policy. And that's why everything gets removed unless it's technically too difficult to do so. And the reason, where it sits within the guidance notes, there's no legal backing to the guidance notes. Yeah, there's no, like just what Professor Patterson was saying earlier, there's no legal basis for it. Yeah, it's the Secretary of State who's decided this is his policy. He could change it tomorrow, or she could change it tomorrow, or the new Labour government could change it tomorrow, which would give you speed. And what that would do, the value of that, is that if you have a precautionary principle based on science, like every other international legislation and everything else there, what happens is then have discussion during the comparative assessment process. And what that then does, so there's about 200 fields in the UKCS that still need to be decommissioned. They cost about, a decommissioning programme costs between £1.5 and £2 million to do. About half of that is on your environmental impact assessment, which includes probably 3 weeks on a boat doing sampling. Yeah, so if you change the clear seabed to the precautionary principle in the international law, you then open up the opportunity that things could be better than the clear seabed, and the million or half a million or £1 million everyone is spending on these 200 fields, yeah, all that environmental information then becomes part of the decommissioning programme, which then becomes part of the public when they get issued to the public to review. And therefore, if you add that up, that's £200 million of funding paid for, that the oil companies have got to pay for anyway, into environmental research into the North Sea. It only requires the Secretary of State to change that and his own interpretation, which could be done tomorrow. Well, the Labour government could do it.
Thank you, Richard. I'm not sure if anyone...
Up to about 6 years research.
I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment on that or not. Yes, Hank.
I'll take a comment on that, Richard. Like I think what you outlined is an interesting idea. I think to not quote Lord May correctly, but I think it was said a while ago that the role of the scientist is not to decide, but rather to provide the evidence base. And so I think in what you propose, really, where we're sitting is to try and provide that evidence base, but obviously to understand what the questions are. And we're getting to a point where there are very interesting questions emerging, and the science is getting more interesting and a bit more pointy. And so I think as we're going forward, what you've outlined there is an interesting process, and really that will belong in the policy space. And so I suppose as a research community, we would be looking to inform that policy community, and as yourself, with ideas on how that could be interpreted or carried out, would be the mechanism for that.
Thank you, Hank. Anybody else? No? Anyone else from the floor? No. Georgina's got a question. Yeah.
So this is just an open panel question, Georgina, with the Insight programme. Really kind of reflecting on some of the things that you've all just touched on there and the session theme. And something that Martin spoke about in his presentation, moving in this fast-paced environment with lots of evidence gaps and evidence needs and policy questions to be answered, wondering if there is some preferred way of communication and collaboration. What are the best ways to communicate that evidence? And from the panel, all sitting from different backgrounds and different work areas, I think it's very useful for people in the room to get an idea of, the best ways of communicating science and how you each think about that.
Great question, Georgina. Hank's already talked about that a bit, so I'm going to go to the others first, I think. If we go from right to left, as I'm looking at you, Martin, if you want to go first.
A really interesting question, thank you. Personally, I have an academic background, a science background, so if the easiest way for you to communicate is through a science publication or a report, then I'm happy to take that on board and to distill it and share it. If you think there are messages that aren't in there that you think I should be communicating, or an opportunity that if it got to the ear of the policy, we could put a submission up to a Secretary of State, for instance, to make a decision, then I'm very open to that, however formal or informal it is. It could just be a couple of points in a covering email, for instance. But the policy briefs that Insight did were a really good way to get that directly across to the policy teams. But in our role, we can also do that. So there are different mechanisms, and I don't think there's one perfect mechanism, but certainly it could just be that informal conversation and sort of triggering a thought. And I will interpret something differently to Chris, to others in our team, to policy teams. So sometimes having those discussions is what promotes the thinking and the insight.
Thanks, Martin. Chris?
Yeah, from my perspective, I agree with everything that Martin has just said there. I think on a generalistic way of saying things, it's been a real incredible transition that we've all had through the COVID pandemic, where we've worked at home and we've networked. It seemed like it gave a nitro boost to some of the things that we've got now, such as Teams and WebEx and stuff like that. So you know, in the room today, I don't doubt that there's people from all across the UK and maybe even further, which is absolutely fantastic for collaboration. And so I'm always open to a Teams call, you know, a collaborative meeting and all that sort of stuff. And I can sit at my home in Aberdeen and talk to someone who's in London or whatever. So that's a really, really fantastic thing that we've got and a tool that we can use. And utilising that is so, so important for all of us. To go on to Martin's points as well, and thinking about those policy briefs, Henk, that were through the Insight seminars, I think there's something that I've been quite intrigued by is, and there was a previous session as well, is liaising with the wider community, but looking into arts and presenting information and sharing information in different ways, perhaps visually, like those lovely illustrations, or visually with videos and all that sort of stuff. And that can get your message across in new, innovative, and easier to understand ways, which I would really like to engage with more, just on a sort of personal interest sort of level. Furthermore, I think it's great to be part of these scientific conferences. That's where we really get to share a lot of information and network with people that we may not necessarily meet, or find those connections which we didn't know were there before. And so that's incredibly valuable. What I will say to the day-to-day and the business as usual is that, and I might be speaking for my team here, but in my experience, from an evidence perspective to a policy perspective, the amount of information and the translation that's needed there is often a filtration or a refinement. As Martin had said about taking a scientific paper and distilling it into 3 sentences, that is in itself, and I'm praising Martin here, that's an art form. That is difficult to do, and that's our challenge. And so if anyone can work with us to help us with that role, obviously we're quite confident in it and competent, but if you can help us with that role to understand, this is what I want to get across, these are the main parts, that's incredibly helpful to us, and we can advise, this is what policy want to know, the so what, which I think is often difficult to disentangle when you see policy documents which are written in a sort of a strange manner, or not a strange manner, but a difficult to interpret manner at times. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Just very, very briefly to add, the message that we put across to a policy team may be different for different policy teams. You can have the one source document, but it's relevant in a different way to noise or to contaminants or to litter.
Yeah. Thanks, Martin. Eddie?
Just said what I was going to say, really. I think it depends who you're talking to. That's my experience anyway. Do a lot of quite numerical stuff with metrics and things, and you can see people glaze over if they're used to talking policy or they're used to talking scenario. So let's get a scenario. Let's actually look at a port development and then get that on the table, and we can pull some numbers up around that. And that brings it alive, I think, certainly in my area, but I'm working on much less technical things than a lot of you were talking about yesterday. So, yeah, I think just gauging your audience and getting to know your audience. So I quite often work with the same people every day or every week, or at least very regularly. And so you start to find out what works and what doesn't, what loses the audience.
Thank you, Eddie. Flora?
Yeah, I think there are some obvious things like, not using scientific names and using common names. It's similar across all accessibility kind of concepts. Speaking plain English and always bringing it back to that so what, like why should we care? It's great to know about all these different techniques and they've got challenges, but how is that going to help tackle the climate emergency? Like really always bringing it right back to that. Also, it always seems like the science to policy is a one. People think of it as a one-way flow, but I don't think of it like that. I think of it more of an interface, and it's got to be a two-way flow, right? So you might, in my background of conservation, I might get a really amazing piece of research, but it's just on a species that's not a protected feature, or it's really great, but there's only so much we can do with that piece of information. But so there's a role for the policymakers to also communicate, and we both need to speak the other's language to say these are the really important evidence gaps, and this is what it would be great for you to focus on when there's a limited resource to only do a certain amount of research. So with ScotMer, the Scottish Marine Energy Research Programme, we've developed these evidence maps, a bit like the OER, Offshore Evidence, Environmental Evidence Register, And so this is a really great way. Every time we get a university saying, right, we've got our master's projects coming up, have you got any ideas? We can just send them these evidence gaps, and they can see what the high priority ones are, can see, okay, we don't have the techniques in our organisation to do that one, but we could do this one. So I think, yeah, it's always, and then it's the role for the scientists to say, wait a minute, you're asking the wrong questions to the policymakers, and you're never going to get an answer to that using the science, because, I don't know, the biology of this species just isn't going to do that. So it's definitely like a two-way thing, I think, rather than just give us all this evidence, you know.
Thanks, Flora. I'd like to add to that from an experience of being in a science advisory role. 3 things, I guess. The first is acknowledge that there are experts on both sides. The people who sit in government and who are regulators and policymakers are experts at decision-making. That's their job. They've got decades of experience in it, and they know the types of things that they need, but they're not experts in science. And acknowledging that there is expertise on both sides is really important. The other thing I would say is no one really cares about the methodology. That sounds really brutal. But the fact that you are published academics, you are experts in your field, you don't need to demonstrate to government that your methodologies are correct. That's what you do in your community. That's what the peer review bit is about. And if you're presenting your methodology to people who aren't experts, all you're going to do is confuse them. Give them the results and tell them why it's important. And the rest of it is taken for granted. And then the third thing is you don't get if you don't ask. You've got people up here who are saying, just email us, let us know. And actually, if you don't reach out to those people, then they're not going to get it through osmosis. So you've got to lean into that community in the same way that our government colleagues need to lean into the academic community, which is why they're here today. So, yes, that's the 3 things I would say. Great. Brilliantly, we managed to take up 15 minutes of my allotted 30 minutes time at the end that I wasn't going to use, which we needed to because lunch isn't until 1 o'clock. But I'm gonna close the conference now, and I guess the only thing I really have to say is, well, I guess thank you to all the speakers and all the people who are attending. Thank you to the people who funded the last decade of research for Insights. We've got several of them in the room today, and NERC, and I think Jess and Mike might be online, maybe, hopefully, out there in the ether. We wouldn't be where we are today without collaboration, cooperation, coordination, people putting money forward to do research that we're not really sure where it's going to take us, but we know there are some important questions being answered, and that's really, really, really important. So thank you to all those people that have supported that. Thank you to the HMC team who've basically organised everything, and to the team here at the National Museum of Scotland who've been totally brilliant as well. Let's keep having these conversations. I mean, I think we've come to the end of Insight Phase 2, but it's not the end of Insight. There are other programmes spinning up. Research, as it's being funded by UKRI and it's being funded by joint industry partnerships, both Insight and others, is becoming more and more applied. And the reason it's becoming more and more applied is, as Colin set out yesterday morning, the questions we need to answer now. I was having discussions about whether we could use ecosystem modelling in environmental impact assessment a decade ago, and I was being told it would take us a decade to develop the ecosystem model, so let's not even consider it. But if we'd started developing them a decade or 2 decades ago, we might be in a different place now. And so that sense of urgency is really, really important, both from colleagues in government who are making decisions and colleagues who are in the academic community who have that knowledge that we need to get across as quickly as possible. And I think if you speak to people in the offshore wind industry or the oil and gas decommissioning industry, they're having to make commercial decisions right now. They can't wait for 3 years. They have to make those decisions right now. So it's as important getting what is inside your brains as academics as it is getting what is inside those peer-reviewed papers. The peer-reviewed papers are important because they provide strength and robustness to your science, but the expertise inside your brains is equally important. So please continue to engage. Please continue to engage with hopefully the next phase of Insight and Valmas and events like this. And thank you all for coming today. Thank you.